As far as the importation of African slaves, and then you said there was the exportation of American slaves here in New England as well as in South Carolina. I'm just curious as to what was, or how did they classify these individuals when they moved them from here to other locales? Did they still call them Indians, or they classify them as just like a colored race?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I'll give a general discussion of classification and then people can correct me. In the early records, you see people classified by the names of their nations, and I mean Native American nations. As time goes on, you begin to see them classified as things like mustee. And after a while, you begin to see those who have, who are mixed African and Native American get progressively classified out of the Native American part of their heritage. You begin to get a loss of people's names from the nations from which they come, and they get classified as Indian, and you get a progressive moving out of people who are part Native American, part African American into African American. So the time that, in the time that that I was talking about, which is kind of an earlier colonial period, some of those names still would have been used, but when they get to the Caribbean is when they really get lost into just being called the Indians, because these are exported from the United States because of the rebellions and the revolts, and sold into the Caribbean, where they practically disappear in some of the places that they were expelled to. And that's a different case from the Taino, who always lived there. This is where, you know, this is where they were from. But the ones who were expelled from the United States, parts of the coast down, and they gradually kind of disappear into the population, intermarrying with enslaved Africans, primarily, in the case of the Caribbean. In the case of enslaved Africans, a lot of times the classification comes out of the port by which they left Africa and come to the New World. It doesn't mean that those people are necessarily from that area. They could be in the general hinterland and then get that name and come. In the case of Native Americans, it's different. The one that I showed for Brazil, remember this is very early Brazil. This is like early 1600s. Brazil is founded as a colony in the 1500s. And this expression, negros da terra, blacks of this land, is something that the Portuguese made up. The names of the people who lived in the area are on the coast, especially, were Tupi, Tupinamba, and others, you know, as you go further into the Brazilian interior. But all along the coast, those people were Tupi. So to call them negros da terra is something that the Portuguese, or let's say the Spanish and the Portuguese, are beginning to do a classification as they wish to classify people. So they're classifying them as blacks of this land. And then the ones who are being brought in slightly later from Africa are classified as blacks from Guinea or blacks from Angola. Those would be the two earliest for this place. But you are right, your implication is that these names are mixed up, made up, and in time replace the actual names that the people call themselves.
Yeah. Thank you. I greet you. Shalom. Yeah. So, you know, we know that we had slavery, right? We know that we experienced slavery between Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, you know. And this slave trade was called the triangle slavery trade, or the triangular slave trade, because it took place between 3 or 4 continents, but mostly between 3 continents. So it was forming something like a triangle on the Atlantic trade. Some call it the transatlantic trade, which is true. It took place along the transatlantic. However, there is history that we are not being told. There is a history that we are not told. And one thing you must understand is that historians, the people who write this history, are very selective. They are stereotypical. They are subjective, you know, they are biased. These people write history that they want to favor them. They write history that they want to put themselves in the position of attaining mass empathy. You know, and so some things might happen that they will not show you, but you know, nature has a way of restoring history. Nature has a way of keeping documentation of what happened within itself, you know, in as much as they might try to hide the history that happened from the general community, we still find ways of finding the truth. That is why we have people like archaeologists. Archaeologists are here to dig, are here to extract, they are here to tell us history, how it always been. For example, during the shipment, or rather during the movement of the Israelites from Egypt to Israel, you know, they had to cross the Red Sea. It was just recently that it was discovered the remnants of the Pharaoh's wheels. Those, you know, Kitambo, they used to use chariots, and Pharaoh was following the Israelites with chariots. Now, as they were chasing them along this split Red Sea, God closed it and they got drowned. Historians never ever accepted this fact. It was just up until recently that archaeologists found these remnants. You know, they found the wheel of a huge chariot. We didn't have cars in the past, it was chariots. And the design of the chariot of that wheel was likened to the Pharaoh of that time during Moses. It is called the long expedition. Okay, let's forget about this. We have this Black American professor who is like our archaeologist, you know. She tells us that let's stop believing everything that we read. Let's start believing on the facts. Let's start believing on the empirical evidence that shows black people and Indians, or rather Indians or Red Indians, the way you choose to call them, collaborated with the black people and they fought against the slave master. This is history that is not told because someone somewhere does not want to show himself losing. They want to show themselves winning. And now I want us to watch this video, listen to what the professor has to say, and then by the end of the video, I shall share with you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis.
I learned two things from my elders, both here and in Africa, that are very important to me. And so I want to begin my remarks with those two things. The first thing is that whenever you are standing on soil where the bones of others may be buried deep down below, you begin everything with a salutation of respect to them, even if they're unseen or unknown or unrecognized. So I want to do that first. And secondly, and this is from my grandmother, she always told me, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. In the matter of tonight, what I have is a little knowledge. There are numerous scholars, some of them my colleagues here at Brown, who are making the study of Indian slavery one of the focuses of their work. More importantly, there are historians of the nations and of the communities, of Native Americans and others in this region who know far more than I do about the history of Indian slavery. So my task is to try not to be dangerous, in honor of my grandmother, yet add something useful to the collective pot so that we can have a good discussion. I'm going to do that by focusing on a few thoughts around the question of Indian slavery, which have come up in my own work. That work is not so much about slavery as it is about the kinds of interactions, usually contested and in conditions of violence and duress, but also which occasioned the exchange of knowledge, which took place between indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and colonizing Europeans in the Americas and in Southern Africa. In the interest of time, I want to do this by images. I hope that this setup works. If not, you're going to have to imagine what I'm saying. And I'll give the briefest of remarks about three historical spaces on which my thoughts have been focused in the past, over the past decade. And we might be able to return to some of them later or on another occasion. The first set is going to be about Dutch Brazil and the early 17th century sugar plantations. The second set is from New England to the Caribbean. And the third set is Long Island, from Long Island to Providence, and the Harlem Renaissance. And we'll see if this actually works. Yeah, okay. Except that's not the right one. It's okay. These are just covers of the kinds of natural histories, in other words, the colonial archive that I spend a lot of time looking at. So you get very old histories of the first European natural historian who goes to Barbados or to Jamaica or to Brazil or to Haiti. A lot of these are actually held in here, original copies, in the John Carter Brown Library. I want to spend a moment on this one, which is from Brazil. This is actually the first natural history of Brazil. You can see the European imagination working and how they see the Native Americans, or the Tupi-Namba people, as they call themselves, in Brazil. And the interesting thing about this, this old first natural history of Brazil for me is that I'm always thinking about the knowledge of plants. So the knowledge that enslaved Africans, and in this case in Brazil, the enslaved Tupi-Namba, because everywhere in Latin America, it's first the Native Americans who were enslaved, and then when that doesn't work in some kind of way, Africans are brought in. So the reason why this book is important, done by Willem Piso and George Margraaf, is that it was done in the time when the Dutch briefly held Brazil. Now, we know Brazil is a Portuguese colony, but in the 1640s, the Dutch were holding Brazil, and the governor, Count Moritz of Nassau, thought it important to do scientific studies. So he brings over Willem Piso to look at questions of plants and the knowledge about plants. And in this time, we remember that the knowledge about plants is like knowing where gold and diamonds and oil are later on in history. So Piso does this book. And what do you find when you see the book is that the Tupi-Namba and the enslaved Africans are there on these early sugar plantations at the same time, and they're exchanging knowledge with each other. Most of the book is about what he calls the simples, which are the medicinal plants, the herbal medicines of the Tupi-Namba. But occasionally you find a page like this one that's shown there, where he reports that the Africans are teaching the Indians how, or the indigenous people, how to use particular plants. And so you begin to get a notion of the plants that the Africans managed to bring over, or that were brought over in the slave ship, like sesame, eggplant, and okra. And you also get a sense of how the Tupi-Namba are teaching the enslaved Africans about some very important plants, usually maize, but also cassava, which is the bread of the Caribbean. It's the bread of the Tainos, it's the bread of the Brazilians. The terms that were being used by the Portuguese and the Dutch at this time are also interesting. They called the Tupi-Namba in the beginning, when they enslaved them, negros da terra, the blacks of this land. And the ones who were coming in from Guinea and from Angola, and that's the first set, they are negros de Guinea and negros de Angola. It's an interesting use of the notion of color and slavery. And the picture on the lower right, what you see is, it looks like they're trying to depict Africans, but actually this is an early depiction of Tupi-Namba, who are enslaved and who are put to producing the bread, this bread called cazabe or cassava, depends on which part of the Caribbean or Latin America you're in. And these were first enslaved Tupi-Namba who have to produce this bread. So for me, this is an interesting evidence of not just the enslavement, joint enslavement side by side of Native Americans and enslaved Africans, but also of the knowledge they exchanged and the knowledge and the wealth of knowledge that they bring to the colonizers. This picture is a picture in Africa of Angola, the city of Luanda, and at the same time that the Dutch are holding this part, this tip of Brazil as part of their empire, they're also briefly in charge of or colonizing the Angola kingdom. They never get quite to colonize the Congo kingdom, but the Angola kingdom in Luanda. This is the oldest fort, one of the oldest forts on the coast of Africa. It's San Miguel de Luanda, built in 1576. And the interesting thing is that when the Dutch, built by the Portuguese, when the Dutch take Luanda briefly in the 1640s, they bring over Tupi-Namba masons, stonemasons, sailors on the boats. And some of those Tupi-Namba escape altogether. They melt into the kingdoms, what were then the kingdoms of Congo and Ndongo. So one interesting research question for me is sort of like the disappeared Taino. where did these people go? And what would thinking about them teach us about slavery and relations among Africans and Native Americans with respect to slavery, and not just slavery. This is a picture with which I'm sure it depicts things that most people in this region would be familiar with, which is the massacre of the Pequot in 1937 in Connecticut. This is one of the beginnings of a massive deportation of Native American people from New England to the Caribbean. So it then posits another question: where did these people go? They go to everywhere in the Caribbean. They go to the Bahamas, they go to Barbados, they go to Jamaica. So when I was a child, probably like many of you who are at least my age or older, we were always taught the Indians, the Native Americans, are largely disappeared. I have there a quote from Herman Melville, the book that we all had to read in school, Moby Dick, where he says, you know, the name of the boat, the ship is the Pequot, first of all, and we don't even know why it's the Pequot when we're reading it. But he says, you will no doubt remember, the Pequot was the name of a celebrated tribe of Massachusetts Indians now extinct as the ancient Medes. So he's writing this in 1851, but these supposedly extinct people, many of them are not just still here in New England, but are also in the Caribbean. And in fact, one of the things that was most astonishing to me in trying to do the research of Black people and Native Americans side by side in this question of slavery is an intra-American slave trade that went on in the Caribbean, a waterborne traffic. They didn't cross the Atlantic, but was going around in the Caribbean, was a very, very large flow of slavery. The estimate now is that over a period of 400 years, more than 2.5 million Native persons, many of them from New England, were in slavery in the Caribbean. This is besides the Taino who lived there. This is another set. And this saltwater trade expelled them all over the Caribbean, to Little Bonaire and Curacao, to the many small Lucayas, to Hispaniola, and to Puerto Rico. In fact, one study done by Resendez, which is called The Other Slavery, is that in the period between 1670 and 1720, from the Carolinas, South Carolina in particular, more Indians were exported out of Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were imported into Charleston, South Carolina. So one of the chief things that I've been doing in trying to do research about botanical knowledge in the Caribbean is looking at this question of Black people and Native Americans, or enslaved Africans and enslaved Native Americans, living side by side during a period when we were told, at least when I was in school, that all these people had disappeared. So you get, for example, the famous work by Hans Sloane in Jamaica. And if you read the archive, if you read the original, which many of these originals are in Brown's JCB library, you get this understanding that these supposedly disappeared Indians and these enslaved Africans are actually living side by side for quite some time in many of the Caribbean countries. This is a quote just from Jamaica, from the Natural History of Jamaica done by one Hans Sloane, in which he talks over and over again about the Indians and the Negroes, the Indians and the Negroes, even Indian and Negro doctors, and the diseases that they were able to cure using plants that were natural to Jamaica. And deep inside the book, the Hans Sloane book, is an account of a Lucaya, which is the other name for the Bahamas, a Lucaya couple enslaved in Hispaniola, and how they tried to get away. And then they're returned to slavery. So you have to ask yourself, we all learn in school about how Native Americans disappeared in the United States, supposedly, how they disappeared as well in the Caribbean, but they show up over and over again in these natural histories. So one of the things that also shows up in these old colonial histories is a question of Native American revolt, enslaved African revolt, and how afraid the colonists up and down the East Coast and down into the Caribbean were of this revolt. So in 1502, you get one of the earliest ones where the Spanish governor of Hispaniola asks the king of Spain. Essentially, he just says, please don't send me any more of these African slaves. Let's have a moratorium, because they run away to the mountains of Hispaniola, which today is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and they don't come back. And furthermore, they pair up with the Native Americans who are the Taino who are fleeing, and we don't know what's going on up in the mountains, but it's dangerous, so let's just have a moratorium. You move to 1676, and this is from a study done by Professor Linford. Yeah, where are you? I think he's here somewhere. Exactly. One of his early studies, because he continues to do this work. Dangerous Designs, the 1676 Barbados Act to prohibit New England Indian slave importation. They were by now very, very afraid of these Native Americans who had revolted and who almost won the war in this region. And so several thousands of them are deported. And the governor down in Barbados says that, you know, he really doesn't want any more of these. Many of them are already there, but he says he really doesn't want any more of these because it's like a contagion to have them. These Native American uprisings that are taking place in Virginia and Maryland and New York, and now these people are deported or sold down into the Caribbean and causing trouble. This happens over and over again in the Caribbean. The quote at the bottom is from a famous Caribbean poet and historian, Kamal Brathwaite, and he writes a poem about, just part of it, is about the Maroon Coast in Barbados, which many people think, oh, there weren't any Native Americans left there. And he writes about the ones that got away, the ones that found a settlement somewhere on the coast, which they call the Maroon Coast of Barbados. And he talks about how they got away and how important it is that they found their freedom. Done something wrong. Yes. So the reason why this is called Native Revolt, Black Revolt, and Colonial Fears is that this question of Native Americans and not yet African Americans, but enslaved Africans joining together in possible revolt was one of the biggest fears of colonial times. Finally, I want to talk about, briefly about, how shall I call this? By then, this is a question of a cultural resistance, is basically what we're left with in the New England area. And this woman, usually you get to see histories about, what's the name? Cuffey? Paul Cuffey, yes. So I thought I would use a woman instead of Paul Cuffey because he's fairly well known. This lady is called Olivia Ward Bush, and she was both Native American and African American, and she writes a very famous poem, at least famous in the time, in 1898 in Newport, called Driftwood. And although it's a fairly sad-seeming poem, it's actually a poem about resistance. It's actually a poem about the fact that, like Driftwood, the Native Americans, who by then are very much mixed in this area of New England with African Americans, still managed to endure. And in the final part, she says that with their lives, some poor misshapen remnant still survives of what was once a fair and beauteous form, and yet some dwelling may be more bright. Someone afar may catch a gleam of light after the fury of the blighting storm. This poem is actually a poem about resilience of Native Americans in this New England region. So I want to close with that. I actually had closed with something else, but I didn't bring it with me, which is a weaving, a carving that the Narragansett have kept for a long time, a weaving, which is about the dispersal of the Narragansett through the Caribbean, because I think that also speaks to a kind of history that we want to understand more. So, in conclusion, I want to close with what I hope that some of what I've sketched tonight leads us to think about. The kinds of projects where the historians of the nations and communities, the colonial archives, and a rereading not just of the secrets buried in the soil, but the wisdom inserted in poems and songs, in weavings and carvings, might bring us a greater understanding of the historical phenomenon of Indian slavery in the Americas. I want to suggest that this could lead us not just to new histories of what my friends on the Bahian coast of Brazil call the people of the waters, but new works on the nature of rebellion and revolts for freedom and for sovereignty in the Americas, from the eastern woodlands to Barbados and...
Do you mind? No. What has it meant to you to learn about your traditions? And have the Taino people disappeared? And what are they doing now?
Well, I'm a little, I'm kind of an exception. My parents wanted to never forget my Taino roots by naming me Taino. My sisters have Taino names. My middle sister, her name is Guanina, which is a play on the Guanilla region by which we come from. My middle sister, my oldest sister's middle name is Saray, which is one of the Cacican's daughters, so she's a princess. I was always aware of the existence of Tainos. I grew up in American public schools, so I kind of just ate what was fed to me about Native Americans, about Christopher Columbus. I found out later on in life that Christopher Columbus was a large part of why I didn't know about my people. And then being a Puerto Rican from the Bronx, it was of no surprise that there was black in my blood, African in my blood. Puerto Ricans and blacks in New York City are like one and the same. That was of no shock to me. I think learning about the real breakdown of the conquistador, the Taino, and the African slave, and the trifecta that makes up a modern-day Puerto Rican was an eye-opener to me. I think what really blew my mind was really understanding oral history, documented history, how it all pertains to classification and identity. And so, you know, I've always known myself as a Puerto Rican, but what does that mean? You know, Puerto Rico isn't a country. We don't govern ourselves. And there was a really great article about why is Puerto Rico marching in the Olympics? Why aren't they marching with the United States? So there's an identity crisis among Puerto Ricans, which is very closely tied to the economic crisis in Puerto Rico. And so all of that is the manifestation of a genocide through paper genocide, oral genocide, and literal killing genocide. And so, no, we are not dead. We exist. Our blood has been diluted or diversified, depending on who you ask. Mm-hmm. But we are very alive, and we are very populous. Many of us just don't know it.
Now, guys, what we've just heard here is that slavery had a different story from the one we are told by the Western media, a different story from the one we know, which is written by the white person. One thing you need to understand is that when somebody is writing a text, they will write that text in favor of what they want outside there. You know, many of the texts that we read does not tell us that the Red Indians and the Africans came together to fight against the colonizer. We are not told about that. We are only told that white people conquered the Red Indians and the Africans, and they made them to be slaves. We are not told of how difficult the Europeans were facing in their quest for conquering these two people, you know. And I love it when we have a different side of story, Because a story, one-sided story is never a full story. We have to hear both sides of the story. And you understand that the Indians, or rather the Red Indians, also migrated from other places to that specific United States of America, or rather the larger North America in totality, you know. The US is just a social construct. It's just a name that came later on. But before, it was just a huge landmass. And the original inhabitants, who are the Red Indians, also came there. They found the land bare with just wild animals. So they came there using their technologies. Later on, we also have some history telling us that Africans, not all of them were taken to the Americas as a way of slavery. We had some Africans who went to the Americas as a way of expedition, as a way of having that spirit of navigation and wanting to satisfy it. It's not something that only the white person came with. You know, we are told the history that Africans were native, Africans were primitive, the Red Indians had nothing at all. No, Africans had meditations. Africans had their own religion. Africans knew how to build houses. Africans knew how to hunt. Africans knew agriculture. You know, when God made humans, he made them equal. He made them with equal mental capacity. So we can never say that Africans were uncivilized. We can never say that Africans were foolish. We can never say that Africans didn't have their own method of education. We had our own methods of education. What happens that the Western education came to Africa and it wiped out that education that was passed down to us by our ancestors. And this is a sad story to tell, my dear. We need to come back and think of it this way. Why would the white person, or rather, why would the slave master, is who I mean in this video. When I say white, I mean a slave master. In the context of this video, why would the slave master come here, lie about us, and then sell that lie to you? And why would you as an African believe it? You'd believe it because you don't have knowledge. The professor has just told us that Africans who were taken from Guinea, Africans who were taken from Angola, went to the Americas. They went to the Southern America, to Brazil, for example. They took there their own methods of agriculture. They shared their knowledge of agriculture. They shared their knowledge of farming. They shared their knowledge of medicine. Now, this propaganda that is here, Africans are naive, Africans are this and that, no. These are propaganda that is destined to make you feel inferior about yourself. Who built those pyramids? Who was Mansa Musa? Mansa Musa was the richest man who ever lived. So far, that is what we know as Africans. If not the richest man, but he was very rich, close to the top 10. Very, very rich was Mansa Musa. We also had the Shaka Zulu kingdom. We had kingdoms. The Lewanika kingdom, the Ndebele kingdom, the Wanga kingdom, the Buganda kingdom. We had some kingdoms in West Africa, the Ashanti kingdom of Ghana. Now, somebody coming here and telling us that, oh, you guys knew nothing, we are the ones who brought it to you. No. We had the knowledge of metallurgy. We had the knowledge of creating metals with us. And this is something that has always stayed with us, you know. It's not something that we are born today and we get it today. It's not something that we learn today. It's inherent. Because Africans have always been born, we didn't suffer from diseases. Babies from the past, they didn't underwent vaccination of the modern times. Africans had their own medications. Africans were enslaved, and enslaving Africans did not make them inferior. Actually, these people were just learning from us. They were learning in disguise. They were admirers in disguise. I love what the sisters said. I love what the professor has told us here. This is history that everyone needs to learn. This is history that I listen to this, I get happy. I know that indeed God created us equal. Equal. We didn't have to build skyscrapers with stones. We had the knowledge of building houses. We had the hunting skills. We had the knowledge of splitting an animal and using its skin. Who gave us that? If it's not God himself, who gave Africans that? Now, Africans, you should come back and remember this. That person who writes history is that person who writes history in his favor. Sometimes these people, these scholars, have gone to the extent of even changing the words of God to favor their narrative. They twist it and they change it. But here is where God says that whoever removes, his name shall be removed from the book of life. Whoever adds, sin shall also be added, and punishment shall be added to him. God knew the nature of man. He knew the nature of man even before man became. Now, the whole concept of this is that slavery in itself has also a different story, and this different story we are not told. It's good that we learn. It's good that you understand who you are. Please, many things we experience today is because we don't know who we are. But once you know who you are, chances of becoming who you are high. But if you don't know who you are, the chances of becoming who you are not are very high. Someone will come and tell you, oh, you are a bastard. Okay. You are foolish. Okay. You are this and that. Okay. But is that really who you are? You accept these things because you don't know who you are. Everyone will label you everything they want. Black people had their own superiority. That is one thing I have discovered. During my time doing this YouTube and all this, I came to discover about black people. Black people is not what everyone knows out there. It's not what is told outside there. The reality is twisted, and the reality is far more beautiful than what's shown. Yes. This is EFK Original Documentaries. If you like what I do, kindly support me on Patreon. I shall surely appreciate. See you in the next one.